Nuclear power debate. The nuclear power debate is a long-running controversy about the risks and benefits of using nuclear reactors to generate electricity for civilian purposes. The debate about nuclear power peaked during the 1970s and 1980s as more and more reactors were built and came online, and reached an intensity unprecedented in the history of technology controversies in some countries. Thereafter, the nuclear industry created jobs focused on safety, and public concerns mostly waned. In the 2010-plus decade, with growing public awareness about climate change and the critical role that carbon dioxide and methane emissions plays in causing the heating of the Earth's atmosphere, there was a resurgence in the intensity of the nuclear power debate. Nuclear power advocates and those most concerned about climate change point to nuclear power's reliable, emission-free, high-density energy, alongside a generation of young physicists and engineers working to bring a new generation of nuclear technology into existence to replace fossil fuels. On the other hand, skeptics point to nuclear accidents such as the death of Louis Slotin, the Windscale fire, the 3 Mile Island accident, the Chernobyl disaster, and the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, combined with escalating acts of global terrorism, to argue against continuing use of the technology. Proponents of nuclear energy argue that nuclear power is a clean and sustainable energy source which provides huge amounts of uninterrupted energy without polluting the atmosphere or emitting the carbon emissions that cause global. The use of nuclear power provides plentiful, well-paying jobs, energy security, reduces a dependence on imported fuels, and exposure to price risks associated with resource speculation and Middle East politics. Proponents advance the notion that nuclear power produces virtually no air pollution, in contrast to the massive amount of pollution and carbon emission generated from burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas. Modern society demands always-on energy to power communications, computer networks, transportation, industry, and residences at all times of day and night. In the absence of nuclear power, utilities need to burn fossil fuels to keep the energy grid reliable, even with access to solar and wind energy, because those sources are intermittent. Proponents also believe that nuclear power is the only viable course for a country to achieve energy independence while also meeting their ambitious nationally determined contributions in DC to reduce carbon emissions in a co. They emphasize that the risks of storing waste are small and existing stockpiles can be reduced by using this waste to produce fuels for the latest technology in newer reactors. The operational safety record of nuclear is excellent when compared to the other major kinds of power plants, and by preventing pollution, actually saves lives every year. Opponents say that nuclear power poses numerous threats to people and the environment and point to studies in the literature that question if it will ever be a sustainable energy source. These threats include health risks, accidents, and environmental damage from uranium mining, processing, and transport. Along with the fears associated with nuclear weapons proliferation, nuclear power opponents fear sabotage by terrorists of nuclear plants, diversion and misuse of radioactive fuels or fuel waste, as well as naturally occurring leakage from the unsolved and imperfect long-term storage process of radioactive nuclear waste. They also contend that reactors themselves are enormously complex machines where many things can and do go wrong, and there have been many serious nuclear accidents. Critics do not believe that these risks can be reduced through new technology. They further argue that when all the energy-intensive stages of the nuclear fuel chain are considered, from uranium mining to nuclear decommissioning, nuclear power is not a low-carbon electricity source. History. At the 1963 groundbreaking for what would become the world's largest nuclear power plant, President John F. Kennedy declared that nuclear power was a step on the long road to peace, and that by using science and technology to achieve significant breakthroughs that we could conserve the resources to leave the world in better shape. Yet he also acknowledged that the atomic age was a dreadful age, and when we broke the atom apart, we changed the history of the world. Electricity and energy supplied. Nuclear power output globally saw slow but steady increase till 2006 when it peaked at 791 TWh and then dropped with the lowest level of generation in 2012. The output has since continued to grow from newly connected reactors, returning to pre-Fukushima levels in 2019. In the same year, United States fleet of nuclear reactors produced 800 TWh low-carbon electricity, with an average capacity factor of 92%. Energy security. For many countries, nuclear power affords energy independence. For example, fossil fuel crisis in 1970s was the main driver behind France's Mesmer Plan. Nuclear power has been relatively unaffected by embargoes, and uranium is mined in countries willing to export, including Australia and Canada. Periods of low prices of fossil fuels and renewable energy typically reduced political interest towards nuclear power, while periods of expensive fossil fuels and underachieving renewable energy increased it. Increased interest in climate change mitigation, low-carbon energy, and global energy crisis resulted in what was described as another nuclear renaissance in late 2020s. Sustainability. Reliability. The United States fleet of nuclear reactors produced 800 TWh zero-emissions electricity in 2019 with an average capacity factor of 92%. In 2010, the worldwide average capacity factor was 80.1%. In 2005, capacity factor is the net power produced divided by the maximum amount possible, running at 100% all the time. Thus, this includes all scheduled maintenance/refueling outages as well as unplanned losses. The 7,000 hours is roughly representative of how long any given reactor will remain critical in a year, meaning that the scram rates translates into a sudden and unplanned shutdown about 0.6 times per year for any given reactor in the world. The unplanned capacity loss factor represents amount of power not produced due to unplanned scrams and postponed restarts. Since nuclear power plants are fundamentally heat engines, waste heat disposal becomes an issue at high ambient temperature. Droughts and extended periods of high temperature can cripple nuclear power generation, and it is often during these times when electricity demand is highest because of air conditioning and refrigeration loads and diminished hydroelectric capacity. In such very hot weather, a power reactor may have to operate at a reduced power level or even shut down. In 2009 in Germany, 8 nuclear reactors had to be shut down simultaneously on hot summer days for reasons relating to the overheating of equipment or of rivers. Overheated discharge water has resulted in significant killing of fish in the past, harming livelihood and raising public concern. This issue applies equally to all thermal power plants, including fossil gas, coal, CSP, and nuclear. Economics. New nuclear plants. The economics of new nuclear power plants is a controversial subject, since there are diverging views on this topic, and multi-billion-dollar investments ride on the choice of an energy source. Nuclear power plants typically have high capital costs for building the plant, but low direct fuel costs, with much of the costs of fuel extraction, processing, use, and long-term storage externalized. Therefore, comparison with other power generation methods is strongly dependent on assumptions about construction timescales and capital financing for nuclear plants. Cost estimates also need to take into account plant decommissioning and nuclear waste storage costs. On the other hand, measures to mitigate global warming, such as a carbon tax or carbon emissions trading, may favor the economics of nuclear power. In recent years, there has been a slowdown of electricity demand growth, and financing has become more difficult, which impairs large projects such as nuclear reactors, with very large upfront costs and long project cycles which carry a large variety of risks. In Eastern Europe, a number of long-established projects are struggling to find finance, notably Belene in Bulgaria and the additional reactors at Chernobyl in Romania, The reliable availability of cheap gas poses a major economic disincentive for nuclear projects. Analysis of the economics of nuclear power must take into account who bears the risks of future uncertainties. To date, all operating nuclear power plants were developed by state-owned or regulated utility monopolies, where many of the risks associated with construction costs, operating performance, fuel price, and other factors were borne by consumers rather than suppliers. Many countries have now liberalized the electricity market, where these risks and the risk of cheaper competitors emerging before capital costs are recovered are borne by plant suppliers and operators rather than consumers, which leads to a significantly different evaluation of the economics of new nuclear power plants. Following the 2011 Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, costs are likely to go up for currently operating and new nuclear power plants due to increased requirements for on-site spent fuel management and elevated design basis threats. New nuclear power plants require significant upfront investment, which was so far mostly caused by highly customized designs of large plants, but can be driven down by standardized, reusable designs, as did South Korea. While new nuclear power plants are more expensive than new renewable energy in upfront investment, the cost of the latter is expected to grow as the grid is saturated with intermittent sources and energy storage, as well as land usage becomes a primary barrier to their expansion. A fleet of small modular reactors can be also significantly cheaper than an equivalent single conventional size reactor due to standardized design and much smaller complexity. In 2020, International Energy Agency called for creation of a global nuclear power licensing framework. Cost of decommissioning nuclear plants. The price of energy inputs and the environmental costs of every nuclear power plant continue long after the facility has finished generating its last useful electricity. Both nuclear reactors and uranium enrichment facilities must be decommissioned, returning the facility and its parts to a safe enough level to be entrusted for other uses. After a cooling-off period that may last as long as a century, reactors must be dismantled and cut into small pieces to be packed in containers for final disposal. The process is very expensive, time-consuming, potentially hazardous to the natural environment, and presents new opportunities for human error, accidents, or sabotage. However, despite these risks, according to the World Nuclear Association, in over 50 years of civil nuclear power experience, the management and disposal of civil nuclear waste has not caused any serious health or environmental problems, nor posed any real risk to the general public. The total energy required for decommissioning can be as much as 50%. In most cases, the decommissioning process costs between US $300 million to US $5.06 billion. Decommissioning at nuclear sites which have experienced a serious accident are the most expensive and time-consuming. In the US, there are 13 reactors that have permanently shut down and are in some phase of decommissioning, and none of them have completed the process. Current UK plants are expected to exceed £73 billion decommissioning costs. Subsidies. Critics of nuclear power claim that it is the beneficiary of inappropriately large economic subsidies, taking the form of research and development, financing support for building new reactors and decommissioning old reactors, and waste, and that these subsidies are often overlooked when comparing the economics of nuclear against other forms of power generation. Nuclear power proponents argue that competing energy sources also receive subsidies. Fossil fuels receive large direct and indirect subsidies, such as tax benefits and not having to pay for the greenhouse gases they emit, such as through a carbon tax. Renewable energy sources receive proportionately large direct production subsidies and tax breaks in many nations, although in absolute terms they are often less than subsidies received by non-renewable energy sources. In Europe, the F7 research program has more subsidies for nuclear power than for renewable and energy efficiency together. Over 70% of this is directed at the ITER fusion project. In the US, Public research money for nuclear fission declined from $21.79 to $35 million between 1980 and 2000. A 2010 report by Global Subsidies Initiative compared relative subsidies of most common energy sources. It found that nuclear energy receives 1.7 US cents per kilowatt hour kWh of energy it produces, compared to fossil fuels receiving 0.8 US cents per kWh, renewable energy receiving 5.0 US cents per kWh, and biofuels receiving 5.1 US cents per kWh. Carbon taxation is a significant positive driver in the economy of both nuclear plants and renewable energy sources, all of which are low emissions in their life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. In 2019, a heated debate happened in the European Union on creation of a green finance taxonomy list intended to create investment opportunities for zero-emission energy technologies. Initially, the basic criterion for inclusion was life cycle emissions at 100 GC/kWh or less, which would include nuclear power, which falls well under this threshold. 12. Under lobbying from European Greens and Germany, an additional do no harm criterion was introduced specifically to exclude nuclear power, which in their intention should exclude nuclear power from the list. In July 2020, W. Jude Moore, former Liberia's Minister for Public Works, called international bodies to start or restart funding for nuclear projects in Africa, following the example of U.S. Development Finance Corporation. Moore accused high-income countries like Germany and Australia of hypocrisy and pulling up the ladder behind them, as they have built their strong economy over decades of cheap fossil or nuclear power, and now are effectively preventing African countries from using the only low-carbon and non-intermittent alternative, the nuclear power. Also in July 2020, Hungary declared its nuclear power will be used as low-emission source of energy to produce hydrogen, while Czechia began the process of approval of public loan to CZ nuclear power station. Indirect nuclear insurance subsidy. Environmental effects. EU taxonomy. Effect on greenhouse gas emissions. High-level radioactive waste. Prevented mortality. In March 2013, climate scientists Pushkar Karacha and James Hansen published a paper in Environmental Science and Technology entitled Prevented Mortality and Greenhouse Gas Emissions from Historical and Projected Nuclear Power. It estimated an average of 1.8 million lives saved worldwide by the use of nuclear power instead of fossil fuels between 1971 and 2009. The paper examined mortality levels per unit of electrical energy produced from fossil fuels, coal and natural gas, as well as nuclear power. Karacha and Hansen assert that their results are probably conservative, as they analyze only deaths and do not include a range of serious but non-fatal respiratory illnesses, cancers, hereditary effects, and heart problems, nor do they include the fact that fossil fuel combustion in developing countries tends to have a higher carbon and air pollution footprint than in developing. The authors also conclude that the emission of some 64 billion tons, 7.10 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent have been avoided by nuclear power between 1971 and 2009, and that between 2010 and 2050, nuclear power could additionally avoid up to 8,240 billion tons, 8.8. A 2020 study on energy wind found that if Germany had postponed the nuclear phase-out and phased out coal first, it could have saved 1,100 lives and $12 billion in social costs per year. In 2020, the Vatican has praised peaceful nuclear technologies as a significant factor to alleviation of poverty and the ability of countries to meet their development goals in a sustainable way. Accidents and safety. Chernobyl steam explosion. The Chernobyl steam explosion was a nuclear accident that occurred on 26 April 1986 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine. A steam explosion and graphite fire released large quantities of radioactive contamination into the atmosphere, which spread over much of Western USSR and Europe. It is considered the worst nuclear power plant accident in history, and is one of only two classified as a Level 7 event on the International Nuclear Event Scale, the other being the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster. The battle to contain the contamination and avert a greater catastrophe ultimately involved over 500,000 workers and cost an estimated 18 billion rubles, crippling the Soviet economy. The accident raised concerns about the safety of the nuclear power industry, slowing its expansion for a number of years. Despite the fact the Chernobyl disaster became a nuclear power safety debate icon, there were other nuclear accidents in USSR at the Mayak nuclear weapons production plant nearby Chelyabinsk, Russia, and total radioactive emissions in Chelyabinsk accidents of 1949, 1957, and 1967 together were significantly higher than in Chernobyl. However, the region near Chelyabinsk was and is much more sparsely populated than the region around Chernobyl. The United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, UNSEER, has conducted 20 years of detailed scientific and epidemiological research on the effects of the Chernobyl accident. Apart from the 57 direct deaths in the accident itself, UNSEER predicted in 2005 that up to 4,000 additional cancer deaths related to the accident would appear among the 600 persons receiving more significant exposures, liquidators working in 19A, evacuees, and residents of the most contaminated. According to BBC, it is conclusive that around 5,000 cases of thyroid cancer, most of which were treated and cured, were caused by the contamination. Many suspect that the radiation has caused or will cause other cancers, but the evidence is patchy. Amid reports of other health problems, including birth defects, it still is not clear if any can be attributed. Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus have been burdened with the continuing and substantial decontamination and healthcare costs of the Chernobyl disaster. Fukushima disaster. Following an earthquake, tsunami, and failure of cooling systems at Fukushima, a nuclear power plant, and issues concerning other nuclear facilities, in Japan on 11 March 2011, a nuclear emergency was declared. This was the first time a nuclear emergency had been declared in Japan, and 140,000 residents within 20 km 12 mi of the plant were evacuated. Explosions and a fire resulted in increased levels of radiation, sparking a stock market collapse and panic buying in supermarkets. The UK, France, and some other countries advised their nationals to consider leaving Tokyo in response to fears of spreading nuclear contamination. The accidents drew attention to ongoing concerns over Japanese nuclear seismic design standards and caused other governments to re-evaluate. John Price, a former member of the Safety Policy Unit at the UK National Nuclear Corporation, said that it might be 100 years before melting fuel rods can be safely removed from Japan's Fukushima nuclear plant. 3 Mile Island accident. The 3 Mile Island accident was a core meltdown in Unit 2, a pressurized water reactor manufactured by Babcock and Wilcox of the 3 Mile Island nuclear generating station in Dauphin County, Pennsylvania, near Harrisburg, United States, in 1979. It was the most significant accident in the history of the U.S. commercial nuclear power generating industry, resulting in the release of approximately 2.5 million curies of radioactive noble gases and approximately 15 curies of iodine-131. Cleanup started in August 1979 and officially ended in December 1993, with a total cleanup cost of about $1 billion. The incident was rated a 5 on the 7-point International Nuclear Event Scale accident with wider consequences. The health effects of the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident are widely, but not universally, agreed to be very low level. However, there was an evacuation of 140,000 pregnant women and preschool-age children from the area. The accident crystallized anti-nuclear safety concerns among activists and the general public, resulted in new regulations for the nuclear industry, and has been cited as a contributor to the decline of new reactor construction. that was already underway in the 1970s. New reactor designs. The nuclear power industry has moved to improve engineering design. Generation Roman IV reactors are now in late-stage design and development to improve safety, sustainability, efficiency, and cost. Key to the latest designs is the concept of passive nuclear safety. Passive nuclear safety does not require operator actions or electronic feedback in order to shut down safely in the event of a particular type of emergency, usually overheating resulting from a loss of coolant or loss of cool. This is in contrast to older yet common reactor designs, where the natural tendency for the reaction was to accelerate rapidly from increased temperatures. In such a case, cooling systems must be operative to prevent meltdown. Past design mistakes like Fukushima in Japan did not anticipate that a tsunami generated by an earthquake would disable the backup systems that were supposed to stabilize the reactor after the earthquake. New reactors with passive nuclear safety eliminate this failure mode. The United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission has formally engaged in pre-application activities with 4 applicants who have Generation Roman IV reactors. Of those 4 applicants' designs, 2 are molten salt reactors, 1 is a compact fast reactor, and 1 is a modular high-temperature gas-cooled reactor. Whistleblowers. Health effects on population near nuclear power plants and workers. A major concern in the nuclear debate is what the long-term effects of living near or working in a nuclear power station are. These concerns typically center around the potential for increased risks of cancer. However, studies conducted by nonprofit, neutral agencies have found no compelling evidence of correlation between nuclear power and risk of cancer. There has been considerable research done on the effect of low-level radiation on humans. Debate on the applicability of linear no-threshold model versus radiation hormesis and other competing models continues, however. The predicted low rate of cancer with low dose means that large sample sizes are required in order to make meaningful conclusions. A study conducted by the National Academy of Sciences found that carcinogenic effects of radiation does increase with dose. The largest study on nuclear industry workers in history involved nearly 500,000 individuals and concluded that 1–2% of cancer deaths were likely due to occupational dose. This was on the high range of what theory predicted by Alenti, but was statistically compatible. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission (NRC) has a fact sheet that outlines 6 different studies. In 1990, the United States Congress requested the National Cancer Institute to conduct a study of cancer mortality rates around nuclear plants and other facilities covering 1950 to 1984 focus. They concluded in no link. In 2000, the University of Pittsburgh found no link to heightened cancer deaths in people living within 5 miles of plant at the time of the 3 Mile Island accident. The same year, the Illinois Public Health Department found no statistical abnormality of childhood cancers in counties with nuclear plants. In 2001, the Connecticut Academy of Science and Engineering confirmed that radiation emissions were negligibly low at the Connecticut Yankee nuclear power plant. Also that year, the American Cancer Society investigated cancer clusters around nuclear plants and concluded no link to radiation, noting that cancer clusters occur regularly due to unrelated reasons. Again, in 2001, the Florida Bureau of Environmental Epidemiology reviewed claims of increased cancer rates in counties with nuclear plants. However, using the same data as the claimants, they observed no abnormalities. Scientists learned about exposure to high-level radiation from studies of the effects of bombing populations at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. However, it is difficult to trace the relationship of low-level radiation exposure to resulting cancers and mutations. This is because the latency period between exposure and effect can be 25 years or more for cancer and a generation or more for genetic damage. Since nuclear generating plants have a brief history, it is early to judge the effects. Most human exposure to radiation comes from natural background radiation. Natural sources of radiation amount to an average annual radiation dose of 295 milligrams (0.295 sieverts). The average person receives about 53 mrem (0.53 SV) from medical procedures and 10 mrem from consumer products per year as of May 2011. According to the National Safety Council, people living within 50 miles 80 km of a nuclear power plant receive an additional 0.1 mrem per year. Living within 50 miles of a coal plant adds 0.3 mrem per year. In its 2000 report, Sources and Effects of Ionizing Radiation, the UNSEER also gives some values for areas where the radiation background is very high. You can, for example, have some value like 370 nanograys per hour, 0.32 rad/on average in Yangjiang, China, meaning 3.24 msv per year or 324 mrem or 1800 nji/h1.6 rad/a in Kerala, India, meaning 15.8 msv per year or. There are also some other hot spots with some maximum values of 17,000 nji/h15 rad/a in the hot springs of Ramsar, Iran, that would be equivalent to 149 msv per year, pr 14,900 mrem per year. The highest backgrounds seem to be in Garipari with a reported 175 msv per year or 17,500 mrem per year, and 90,000 nji/h79 rad/a maximum value given in the UNSEER report on the beaches. A study made on the Kerala radiation background using a cohort of 385,103 residents concludes that showed no excess cancer risk from exposure to terrestrial gamma radiation, and that although the statistical power of the study might not be adequate due to the low dose, our cancer incidence study suggests it is unlikely that plans call for different zones, defined by distance from the plant and prevailing weather conditions and protective actions. In the reference cited, the plans detail different categories of emergencies and the protective actions, including possible evacuation. A German study on childhood cancer in the vicinity of nuclear power plants, called the KKK study, was published in December 2007. According to Ian Fairley, it resulted in a public outcry and media debate in Germany which has received little attention elsewhere. It has been established partly as a result of an earlier study by Korblein and Hoffman, which had found statistically significant increases in solid cancers 54% and in leukemia 76% in children aged less than 5 within 5 km 3.1 mi of 15 German nuclear power plant sites. It read a 2.2-fold. In 2011, a new study of the KKK data was incorporated into an assessment by the Committee on Medical Aspects of Radiation in the Environment COMER of the incidence of childhood leukemia around British nuclear. It found that the control sample of population used for comparison in the German study may have been incorrectly selected, and other possible contributory factors, such as socioeconomic ranking, were not taken into consideration. The committee concluded that there is no significant evidence of an association between risk of childhood leukemia in under 5-year-olds and living in proximity to a nuclear power plant. European Commission Joint Research Centre report of 2021 see above concluded. The average annual exposure to a member of the public due to effects attributable to nuclear energy-based electricity production is about 0.2 microsievert, which is 10,000 times less than the average annual dose due to the natural background radiation. According to the ELSIA Life Cycle Impact Analysis studies analyzed in Chapter 3.4 of Part A, the total impact on human health of both the radiological and non-radiological emissions from the nuclear energy chain are comparable with the human health impact from offshore wind energy. Safety culture in host nations. Some developing countries which plan to go nuclear have very poor industrial safety records and problems with political corruption. Inside China and outside the country, the speed of the nuclear construction program has raised safety concerns. Prof. He Zhuoxiu, who was involved with China's atomic bomb program, has said that plans to expand production of nuclear energy 20-fold by 2030 could be disastrous, as China was seriously underprepared on the safety front. China's fast-expanding nuclear sector is opting for cheap technology that will be 100 years old by the time dozens of its reactors reach the end of their lifespans, according to diplomatic cables from the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. The rush to build new nuclear power plants may create problems for effective management, operation, and regulatory oversight, with the biggest potential bottleneck being human resources. Coming up with enough trained personnel to build and operate all of these new plants, as well as regulate the industry. The challenge for the government and nuclear companies is to keep an eye on a growing army of contractors and subcontractors who may be tempted to cut corners. China is advised to maintain nuclear safeguards in a business culture where quality and safety are sometimes sacrificed in favor of cost-cutting, profits, and corruption. China has asked for international assistance in training more nuclear power plant inspectors. Nuclear proliferation and terrorism concerns. Opposition to nuclear power is frequently linked to opposition to nuclear weapons. Anti-nuclear scientist Mark C. Jacobson believes the growth of nuclear power has historically increased the ability of nations to obtain or enrich uranium for nuclear weapons. However, many countries have civilian nuclear power programs, while not developing nuclear weapons, and all civilian reactors are covered by IA non-proliferation safeguards, including international inspections at the plants. Iran has developed a nuclear power program under IA treaty controls and attempted to develop a parallel nuclear weapons program in strict separation of the latter to avoid IA inspections. Modern light water reactors used in most civilian nuclear power plants cannot be used to produce weapons-grade uranium. A 1993–2013 megatons to megawatts program successfully led to recycling 500 tons of Russian warhead-grade high-enriched uranium equivalent to 20,008 nuclear warheads. 4,000 reactors, which were designed by the American Westinghouse Electric Company, are currently, as of 2011, being built in China, and a further 2,000 reactors are to be built in the U.S. Hyperion Power Generation, which is designing modular reactor assemblies that are proliferation resistant, is a privately owned U.S. corporation, as is TerraPower, which has the financial backing of Bill Gates and his Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Vulnerability of plants to attack. Development of covert and hostile nuclear installations was occasionally prevented by military operations in what is described as radical counterproliferation activities. Operation Gunnerside 1943 by Allies against Heavy Water Factory in German-occupied Norway. Operation Scorched Sword 1980 by Iran against construction site of Osirak nuclear complex construction site in Iraq. Operation Opera 1981 by Israel against the same Osirak site in Iraq. Iraqi Air Force attacks on unfinished Bushehr nuclear plant in Iran during Iraq-Iran War 1986–1987. Operation Outside the Box 2007 by Israel against a suspected Al-Kibar nuclear construction site in Syria. No military operations were targeted against live nuclear reactors, and no operations resulted in nuclear incidents. No terrorist attacks targeted live reactors, with the only recorded quasi-terrorist attacks on a nuclear power plant construction sites by anti-nuclear activists. 1977–1982 ETA performed numerous attacks, including bombings and kidnappings, against Lebanese nuclear power plant construction's site and its personnel. 18 January 1982, when environmental activist Chaim Nissim fired RPG rockets at Superphénix reactor construction site in France, causing no damage, according to a 2004 report by the U.S. Congressional Budget Office. The human, environmental, and economic costs from a successful attack on a nuclear power plant. The United States 9/11 Commission has said that nuclear power plants were potential targets originally considered for the 11 September 2001 attacks. If terrorist groups could sufficiently damage safety systems to cause a core meltdown at a nuclear power plant and slash or sufficiently damage spent fuel pools, such an attack could lead to a widespread radioactive contamination. New reactor designs have features of passive safety, such as the flooding of the reactor core without active intervention by reactor operators. But these safety measures have generally been developed and studied with respect to accidents, not to the deliberate reactor attack by a terrorist group. However, the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission now also requires new reactor license applications to consider security during the design stage. Use of waste byproduct as a weapon. There is a concern if the byproducts of nuclear fission, the nuclear waste generated by the plant, were to be left unprotected, it could be stolen and used as a radiological weapon, colloquially known as a dirty bomb. No actual terrorist attacks involving dirty bomb were ever recorded, although cases of illegal trade of fissile material happened. There are additional concerns that the transportation of nuclear waste along roadways or railways opens it up for potential theft. The United Nations has since called upon world leaders to improve security in order to prevent radioactive material falling into the hands of terrorists, and such fears have been used as justifications for centralized, permanent, and secure waste repositories and increased security along transportation routes. The spent fissile fuel is not radioactive enough to create any sort of effective nuclear weapon in a traditional sense where the radioactive material is the means of explosion. Nuclear reprocessing plants also acquire uranium from spent reactor fuel and take the remaining waste into their custody. Public opinion. Support for nuclear power varies between countries and has changed significantly over time. Trends and future prospects. Following the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, the International Energy Agency halved its estimate of additional nuclear generating capacity to be built by 2035. Platts has reported that the crisis at Japan's Fukushima nuclear plants has prompted leading energy-consuming countries to review the safety of their existing reactors and cast doubt on the speed and scale of planned expansions. In 2011, The Economist reported that nuclear power looks dangerous, unpopular, expensive, and risky, and that it is replaceable with relative ease and could be foregone with no huge structural shifts in the way the world works. In September 2011, German engineering giant Siemens announced it will withdraw entirely from the nuclear industry as a response to the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan. The company is to boost its work in the renewable energy sector. Commenting on the German government's policy to close nuclear plants, Werner Sinn, president of the IFO Institute for Economic Research at the University of Munich, stated, "It is wrong to shut down the atomic power plants because this is a cheap source of energy, and wind and solar power are by no means able to provide a replacement. They are much more expensive, and this public distrust is periodically reinforced by safety violations by nuclear companies or through ineffectiveness or corruption on the part of nuclear regulatory authorities. Once lost," says Ramana, "trust is extremely difficult to regain." Faced with public antipathy, the nuclear industry has tried a variety of strategies to persuade the public to accept nuclear power, including the publication of numerous fact sheets that discuss issues of public concern. Ramana says that none of these strategies have been very successful. In March 2012, E.ON UK and RWE in Power announced that they would be pulling out of developing new nuclear power plants in the UK, placing the future of nuclear power in the UK in doubt. More recently, Centrica, who own British Gas, pulled out of the race on 4 February 2013 by letting go its 20% option on 4 new nuclear plants. Cumbria County Council, a local authority, turned down an application for a final waste repository on 30 January 2013. There is currently no alternative site on offer. In terms of current nuclear status and future prospects, 10 new reactors were connected to the grid in 2015, the highest number since 1990, but expanding Asian nuclear programs are balanced by retirements of aging plants and nuclear reactor phase-outs. 7 reactors were permanently shut down. 441 operational reactors had a worldwide net capacity of 382,855 megawatts of electricity in 2015. However, some reactors are classified as operational, but are not producing any power. 67 new nuclear reactors were under construction in 2015, including 4 EPR units. The first 2 EPR projects in Finland and France were meant to lead a nuclear renaissance, but both are facing costly construction delays. Construction commenced on 2 Chinese EPR units in 2009 and 2010. The Chinese units were to start operation in 2014 and 2015, but the Chinese government halted construction because of safety concerns. China's National Nuclear Safety Administration carried out on-site inspections and issued a permit to proceed with function tests in 2016. Taishan 1 is expected to start up in the first half of 2017, and Taishan 2 is scheduled to begin operating by the end of 2017. In February 2020, the world's first open-source platform for the design, construction, and financing of nuclear power plants, OP900, was launched in the United States. This project aims to provide a clear pathway to a sustainable, low-cost, zero-carbon future. Collaborators in the OP900 project include Framatome Studsvik, the UK National Nuclear Laboratory, Siemens, Pillsbury, the Electric Power Research Institute, the U.S. Department of Energy's Idaho National Laboratory, and Oak Ridge National Laboratory. In October 2020, the U.S. Department of Energy announced selecting 2 U.S.-based teams to receive $160 million in initial funding under the new Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program (ARD). Terra Power LLC Bellevue, WA, and X Energy Rockville, ND were each awarded $80 million to build 2 advanced nuclear reactors that can be operational within 7 years. Footnotes: